Deathworld by Harry Harrison. Read by Gerald Frost. Chapter 10. There were empty rooms in one of the computer buildings. These were completely sealed to keep out stray animal life out of the delicate machinery. While Maida checked a bedroll out of stores, Jason painfully dragged a desk, table, and chairs from the nearby empty office. When she returned with a pneumatic bed, he instantly dropped upon it with a grateful sigh. Her lip curled a bit at his obvious weakness. "Get used to the sight," he said. "I intend to do as much of my work as I can while maintaining a horizontal position. You will be my strong right arm. And right now, right arm, I wish you to scare me up something to eat. I also intend to do most of my eating in the previously mentioned prone condition." Snorting with disgust, Maida stamped out. While she was gone, Jason chewed the end of his stylus thoughtfully. He made notes. After they had finished the almost tasteless meal, he began to search. "Maida, where can I find historical records of Pyrrhus?" "I've never heard of any. I really don't know." "But there has to be something, somewhere. Even if present-day culture devotes all of its time and energy to survival, you can be sure it wasn't always that way. All the time it was developing, people were keeping records, making notes. Now, where do we look? Do you have a library here?" "Of course," she said. "We have an excellent technical library, but I'm sure they wouldn't have any of that sort of thing there." Trying not to groan, Jason stood up. "Let me be the judge of that. Just lead the way." Operation of the library was completely automatic. A projected index gave the call numbers to any text that he had to consult. The tape was delivered to the changing desk 30 seconds after the number had been punched. Return tapes were dropped through a hopper and refiled automatically. The mechanism worked smoothly. "Wonderful," Jason said, pushing away from the index. "A tribute to technological ingenuity. It only contains nothing of value to us, just reams of textbooks." "What else should there be in a library?" Maida sounded sincerely puzzled. Jason started to explain and then changed his mind. "Later we'll go into that," he said. "Much later. Now we have to find a lead. Is it possible that there are any tapes or even printed books that aren't filed through this machine?" "It seems unlikely, but we could ask Polly. He lives somewhere around here, and he is in charge of the library, filing new books and tending to the machinery." The single door into the rear of the building was locked, and no amount of pounding could rouse the caretaker. "If he's alive, this should do it," Jason said, pressing an out-of-order button on the control panel. It had the desired effect. Within 5 minutes, the door opened, and Polly dragged himself in. Death usually came swiftly on Pyrrhus. If wounds slowed a man down, the ever-ready forces of destruction quickly finished the job. Polly was the exception to this rule. Whatever had attacked him originally had done an excellent job. Most of the lower part of his face was gone. His left arm was curled and useless. The damage to his body and his legs had left him with the bare capability to stumble from one spot to the next. Yet he still had one good arm, as well as his eyesight. He could work in the library and relieve a fully fit man. How long had he been dragging the useless husk of a body around the building? No one knew. In spite of the pain that filled his red-rimmed, moist eyes, he had stayed alive. Growing old, older than any other Pyrrhian as far as Jason had seen. He tottered forward and turned off the alarm that had called him. When Jason started to explain, the old man took no notice. Only after the librarian had rummaged a hearing aid out of his clothes did Jason realize he was deaf as well. Jason explained again what he searched for. Polly nodded and printed his answer on a tablet. "Many old books in storerooms below." Most of the building was taken up by the robot filing and sorting apparatus. They moved slowly through the banks of machinery, following the crippled librarian to a barred door in the rear. He pointed to it, while Jason and Maida fought to open the age-encrusted bars. He wrote another note on his tablet. "Not open for many years. Rats, Jason and Maida's guns appeared reflexively in their hands as they read the message. Jason finished opening the door by himself. The two native Parians stood facing the opening gap. It was as well that they did. Jason could never have handled what came through that door. Even if he didn't even open it for himself. Their sounds at the door must have attracted all the vermin of the lower parts of the building. Jason had thrown the last bolt and had started to pull on the handle when the door was pushed open from the other side. Open the gateway to hell and see what comes out. Maida and Polly stood shoulder to shoulder, firing into the mass of loathsomeness that boiled through the door. Jason jumped to one side and picked off the occasional animal that came his way. The destruction seemed to go on forever. Long minutes passed before the last clawed beast made its death rush. Maida and Polly waited expectantly for more. They were happily excited by this chance to deal destruction. Jason felt a little sick after this silent, ferocious attack. A ferocity that the Pyreans reflected. He saw a scratch on Maida's face where one of the beasts had caught her. She seemed oblivious to it. Pulling out his medkit, Jason circled the piled bodies. Something stirred in their midst, and a crashing shot plowed into it. Then he reached the girl and pushed the analyzer probes against the scratch. The machine clicked and made a jump as the antitoxin needle stabbed down. She realized for the first time what Jason was doing. "Thank you," she said. Polly had a powerful battery lamp, and, by unspoken agreement, Jason carried it. Crippled though he was, old man though he was still a Parian, and when it came to handling a gun, that came first. They slowly made their way down the refuse-laden stairs. "What a stench!" Jason grimaced. At the foot of the stairs, they looked around. There had been books and records at one time. They had been systematically chewed, eaten, and destroyed for decades. "I like the care you take with your old books," Jason said disgustedly. "They could have been of no importance," said Maida coolly, "or they would have been filed correctly in the library." Jason wandered gloomily through the rooms. Nothing remained of any value. Fragments and scraps of writing and printing, never enough in one spot to bother collecting. With the toe of one armored boot, he kicked angrily at a pile of debris, ready to give up the search. There was a glint of rusty metal under the dirt. "Hold this." He gave the light to Maida and began scratching aside the rubble. A flat metal box with a dial lock built into it was retrieved. "Why, that's a log box," Maida said, surprised. "That's what I thought," Jason said. Resealing the cellar, they carried the box back to Jason's new office. Only after spraying it with disinfectant and decontaminant did they examine it closely. Maida picked out the engraved letters on the lid. "S.T. Pollux Victory. That must be the name of the spacer this log came from, but I don't recognize the class, or whatever the initials ST stand for." "Stellar Transport," Jason told her as he tried the locking mechanism. "I've heard of them, but I've never actually seen one. They were built during the last galactic wave of expansion. Really, nothing more than gigantic metal containers put together in space. After they were loaded with people, machinery, and supplies, they would be towed to whatever planetary system had been chosen. These tugs and the one-shot rockets would break the STs in for a landing and leave them there. The hull was a ready source of metal for the colonists, and they would start right in building their new world. And they were big. All of them held at least 50,000 people." Only after he said it did he realize the significance of his words. Maida's deadly stare drove it home. There were now less people on Pyrrhus than there had been in the original settlement. And human population, without rigid birth controls, usually increases geometrically. Jason Denault remembered Maida's itchy trigger finger. "But we can't be sure how many people were aboard this one," he said hurriedly, "or even if this is the log of the ship that settled Pyrrhus. Can you find something to pry this open with? The lock is corroded into a single lump." Maida took her anger out on the box. Her fingers managed to force open a gap between the lid and the bottom. She wrenched it open. Rusty metal screeched and tore. The lid came off in her hands, and a heavy book thudded to the table. The cover destroyed all doubt. Log of St. Pollock's victory, outward bound. Satani to Piraeus. 55,000 settlers aboard. Maida couldn't argue now. She stood behind Jason with tight clenched fists and read over his shoulder as he turned the brittle, yellowing pages. He quickly skipped through the opening part about covering the sailing preparations and the trip out. Only when he had reached the actual landing did he start reading slowly. The impact of the ancient words leaped out at him. "Here it is," Jason shouted. "Proof positive that we're on the right trail. Even you will have to admit that. Read it, right here. Second day since the tugs left. We are completely on our own now. The settlers still haven't gotten used to this planet, though we have oriented talks every night. As well, the morale agents, who I have working 20 hours a day. I suppose I really cannot blame the people. They all lived in the underways of Satani, and I doubt if they saw the sun once a year. This planet has weather with a vengeance, worse than anything I've seen on 100 other planets. Was I wrong, during the original planning stages, not to insist on settlers from one of the agrarian worlds, people who could handle the outdoors? These citified Satanis are afraid to go out in the rain, but of course they have adapted completely to their native 1.5 gravity, so the 2G here does not bother them much. That was a factor that decided us. Anyway, too late to do anything about it, or about the unending cycle of rain, snow, hail, hurricanes, and such. Answer will be to start the mines going, and sell the metals, and build a completely enclosed city. The only thing on this forsaken planet that isn't actually against us are the animals. A few large predators at first, but the guards made short work of them. The rest of the wildlife leaves us alone. Glad of that. They have been fighting for existence so long that I have never seen a more deadly-looking collection. Even the little rodents, no bigger than a man's hand, are armored like tanks. "I don't believe a word of it," Maida broke in. "That can't be Pyrrhus he's writing about." Her words died away as Jason wordlessly pointed to the words on the cover. He continued scanning the pages, flipping them quickly. A sentence caught his eye, and he stopped, jamming his finger against the place he read aloud. "And troubles keep piling up. First Harpalo, with his theory that the volcanism is so close to the surface that the ground keeps warm and the crops grow so well. Even if he is right, what can we do? We must be self-dependent if we intend to survive. And now this other thing. It seems that the forest fire drove a lot of new species our way. Animals, insects, and even birds have attacked people. Note for Har. Check if possible seasonal migration might explain the attacks. There have been 14 deaths from wounds and poisoning. We have to enforce the rules about insect lotion at all times. And I suppose we could build some sort of a perimeter defense to keep the larger beasts out of the camp." "This is the beginning," said Jason. "At least now we are aware of the real nature of the battle we're engaged in. It doesn't make Pyrrhus any easier to handle, but the life forms are no less dangerous. But to know where they were once better disposed towards mankind, that's important. All this does point the way. Something took the peaceful life forms, shook them up, and turned this planet into one big death camp for mankind. That something is what I want to uncover." Chapter 12. Further reading of the log produced no new evidence. There was a good deal more information about the early animal and plant life and how deadly they were, as well as the first defenses against them. Interesting historically, but no use whatsoever in countering the menace. The captain apparently never thought that life forms were altering on Pyrrhus because he believed that instead dangerous beasts were being discovered. He never lived to change his mind. The last entry in the log, less than 2 months after the first attack, was very brief and in a different hand. Captain Kurkowski died today of poisoning following an insect bite. His death is greatly mourned. The why of the planetary revulsion had yet to be uncovered. Kirk must see this book, Jason said. He should have some idea of the progress being made. Can we get transportation, or do we walk to City Hall? Walk, of course. Then you bring the book. At 2Gs, I find it very hard to be a gentleman and carry the packages. They had just entered Kirk's outer office when a shrill screaming burst out of the phone screen. It took Jason a moment to realize that it was a mechanical signal and not a human voice. "What's that?" he asked. Kirk burst through the door and headed for the street entrance. Everyone else in the office was going in the same direction. Maida looked confused, leaning towards the door, and then looked back at Jason. "What does it mean? Can you tell me?" He took her arm. "Sector alarm. A major breakthrough of some kind in the perimeter. Everyone but our perimeter guards has to answer." "Well, go then," he said. "Don't worry about me. I'll be right in here." His words acted like a trigger release. Maida's gun was in her hand, and she was gone before he had finished speaking. Jason sat down wearily in the deserted office. The unnatural silence of the building began to get on his nerves. He shifted his chair over to the phone screen and switched the receiver to on. The screen exploded with color and sound. At first, Jason could make no sense of it all. Just a confused jumble of faces and voices. It was a multi-channel set designed for military use. A number of the images were carried on the screen at one time, rows of heads or hazy backgrounds where the user had left the field of view. Many of the heads were talking at the same time and the babble from their voices made no sense whatsoever. After examining the controls and making a few experiments, Jason began to understand the operation. Though all stations were on the screen at all times, their audio channels could be controlled. In that way, 2, 3, or more stations could be hooked up together in a link. They would be in a round-robin communication with each other, yet never out of contact with other stations. Identification between voice and sound was automatic. Whenever one of the pictured images spoke, images would glow red. By trial and error, Jason brought in the audio for the stations and waited and tried to follow the course of the attack. Very quickly, he realized that this was something out of the ordinary. In some way, no one made quite clear, a section of the perimeter had been broken through and emergency defenses had been thrown up to encapsulate it. Kirk seemed to be in charge, at least he was the only one with an override transmitter. He used it for general commands. The many tiny images faded, and his face appeared over the top of them, filling the entire screen. "All perimeter stations send 25% of your complement to Area 12. The small images reappeared and the babble increased. Red lights flickered from face to face. "Abandon the first floor. Acid bombs can't reach." "If we hold, we'll be cut off. But salient is past the first west flank. Request support." "Don't move it. It's useless." "And the napalm tanks are almost gone. Orders?" "The truck is there, but to get it to the supply house. You will find replacements." Out of the welter of talk, only the last two fragments made any sense. Jason had noticed the signs below when he came in. The first two floors of the building below him were jammed with military supplies. This was his chance to get into the act. Just sitting here and watching was frustrating, particularly when it was a desperate emergency. He didn't overvalue his worth, but he was sure there was always room for another gun. By the time he dragged himself down to street level, a turbo truck had slammed to a stop in front of the loading platform. Two Pyreans were rolling drums of napalm with reckless disregard for their own safety. Jason didn't dare enter that maelstrom of rolling metal. He found he could be useful hugging the drums into position on the truck while the others were rolled up. They accepted his aid without acknowledgement. It was exhausting, sweaty work, hauling the leaden drums into place against the heavy gravity. After a minute, Jason worked by touch through a red haze of hammering blood. He realized the job was done only when the truck suddenly leaped forward and he was thrown to the floor. He lay there, chest heaving, as the driver hurled the heavy vehicle along. All Jason could do was bounce around and brace himself on the bottom. He could see well enough, but he was still gasping for breath when they braked at the fighting zone. To Jason, it was a scene of incredible confusion. Guns firing, flames, men, women running on all sides. The napalm drums were unloaded without his help, and the truck vanished for more. Jason leaned against a wall of a half-destroyed building and tried to get his bearings. It was impossible. There seemed to be a great number of small animals. He killed 2 that attacked towards him. Other than that, he couldn't determine the nature of the battle. A Pyrrhian, a tan-faced white with pain and exertion, stumbled up. His right arm, wet with raw flesh and dripping blood, hung limply by his side. It was covered with freshly applied surgical foam. He held his gun in his left hand, a stump of the control cable dangling from it. Jason thought the man was looking for medical aid. He could not have been more wrong. Clenching the gun in his teeth, the Pyrrhian clutched a barrel of napalm with his good hand and hurled it over the side. Then, the gun once more in his hand, he began to roll the drum on the ground with his feet. It was slow, cumbersome work, but he was still in the fight. Jason pushed through the hurrying crowd and bent over the drum. "Let me do it," he said. "You can cover us both with your gun." The man wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of his arm and blinked at Jason. He seemed to recognize him. When he smiled, it was a grimace of pain and empty of humor. "Do that. I can still shoot. 2 half-men, maybe we equal 1 whole." Jason was laboring too hard to even notice that he had been insulted. An explosion blasted a raw pit ahead in the street. 2 people were at the bottom, digging it even deeper with shovels. The whole thing seemed meaningless. Just as Jason and the wounded man rolled up the drum, the diggers leaped out of the excavation and began shooting down into its depths. One of them turned, a young girl, barely into her teens. "Praise perimeter," she breathed. "They found the napalm. One of the new horrors is breaking through towards 13. We just found it." Even as she talked, she swiveled the drum around, kicked the easy-off plug, and began dumping the gelled contents into the hole. When half of it had gurgled down, she kicked the drum itself in. Her companion pulled out a flare from his belt, lit it, and threw it after the drum. "Back up quick! They don't like heat," she said. That was putting it very mildly. The napalm caught. Tongues of flames, roiling, greasy smoke climbed out of the sky. Under Jason's feet, the earth shifted and moved. Something black and long stirred in the heart of the flames, and then it arched up into the sky over their heads. In the midst of the searing heat, it still moved with alien, jolting motions. It was immense, at least 2 meters thick, and with no indication of its length. The flames didn't stop it at all. They just annoyed it. Jason had some idea of the thing's length, as the street cracked and buckled for 50 meters on either side of the pit. Great loops of the creature began emerging from the ground. He fired his gun, as did others. Not that it had any effect. More people were appearing, armed with a variety of weapons. Flamethrowers and grenades seemed to be most effective. "Clear the area. We're going to saturate it. Fall back." The voice was so loud it jarred Jason's ears. He turned and recognized Kirk, who had arrived with truckloads of equipment. He had a power speaker on his back, the mic in front of his lips. His amplified voice brought an instant reaction from the crowd. They were beginning to move. There was still a doubt in Jason's mind as to what to do. Clear the area? But what area? He started towards Kirk before he realized that the rest of the Pyrrhians were going in the opposite direction. Even under 2 gravities, they moved. Jason had a naked feeling of being alone on the stage. He was in the center of the street, and the others had vanished. No one remained, except the wounded man Jason had helped. He stumbled toward Jason, waving his good arm. Jason couldn't understand what he said. Kirk was shouting orders again from one of the trucks. They had started to move too. The urgency struck home, and Jason started to run. It was too late. On all sides, the earth was buckling, crackling, breaking open as more loops of the underground thing forced their way into the light. Safety lay ahead, only in front of it rose an arch of dirt-encrusted gray. There are seconds of time that seem to last an eternity, a moment of subjective time that is grabbed and stretched into an infinite distance. This was one of those moments. Jason stood, frozen, even as the smoke hung in the sky, unmoving. The high, standing loop of alien life was before him, every detail piercingly clear. Thick as a man was tall, ribbed and gray as old bark, tendrils projected from all parts of it, pallid, twisting lengths that writhed slowly with snake-like life, shaped like a plant, yet with the motions of an animal, and cracking and splitting. That was horrible. Seams opened and appeared, splintering, gaping mouths that vomited forth a horde of pallid animals. Jason heard their shriekings, shrill yet remote. He saw the needle-like teeth that lined their jaws. The paralysis of the unknown held him there. He should have died. Kirk was thundering at him through the power speaker. Others were firing into the attacking creatures. Jason knew nothing. Then he was shot forward, pushed by a rock-hard shoulder. The wounded man was still there, trying to get Jason clear. The gun clenched in his jaws. He dragged Jason along with his good arm, towards the creature. The others stopped firing. They saw his plan, and it was a good one. A loop of the thing arched into the air, leaving an opening between its body and the ground. The wounded Pyrian planted his feet and tightened his muscles. Open-handed, with a single thrust, he picked Jason off the ground and sent him hurtling under the living arch. Moving tendrils brushed fire along his face, though he was through and rolling over and over on the ground. The wounded Pyrian leaped after him. It was too late. There had been a chance for one person to get out. The Pyrian could have done it, easily. Instead, he had pushed Jason first. The thing was aware of the movement when Jason brushed the tendrils. It dropped and caught the wounded man under its weight. He vanished from sight as the tendrils wrapped around him and the animal swarmed over him. His trigger must have pulled back to full automatic because the gun kept firing a long time after he should have been dead. Jason crawled. Some of the fanged animals ran towards him, but were shot. He knew nothing about this. Then rude hands grabbed him and pulled him forward. He slammed against the side of a truck, and Kirk's face was in front of his, flushed and angry. One of the giant fists closed in front of Jason's clothes, and he was lifted off his feet, shaken like a bag of rags. He offered no protest, and could not even have if Kirk had been going to kill him. When he was thrown to the ground, someone picked him up and slid him into the back of the truck. He did not lose consciousness as the truck bounced away, yet he could not move. A moment of fatigue would go away and he would sit up. That's all it was, just a little tired. Even as he thought this, he passed out. Chapter 13. And we'll leave that for tomorrow. This has been Gerald Frost reading Deathworld by Harry Harrison. Links to former and further chapters are in the description, and I should probably pin them in the comments. Good night.